Kia ora koutou, my name's Tania. I'm the director of Just Speak. I've had the privilege of doing this job for coming up on 3 years, which has flown by. And I'm really privileged to talk to you about advocacy and systems change today, because that is really at the core of Just Speak's kaupapa. As many of those of you who are here in the room today who have supported our work financially or otherwise will know, we think that the New Zealand criminal justice system needs to lift its game massively, that we want to see our vision of a fair and compassionate and effective justice system take place immediately, but realistically sometime over the next decade, and we're working really hard to make that change. So I'll quickly talk about what we do that involves advocacy, and then I'll move quickly to the sort of wider conversation about advocacy, system change, and philanthropy. Unlike some of my co-panelists, systems change and advocacy is kind of the core of our work. We identified a long time ago that the issue with criminal justice reform is not that we don't know what is broken. We are very aware that imprisonment does very little to prevent harm. We are aware that our criminal justice system and those who it disproportionately incarcerates, which in New Zealand is overwhelmingly Māori, that fuels hardship, poverty, exclusion, and marginalisation, and it doesn't help us to address the underlying causes of offending. So we realised that really our role was the way we could best sort of serve our vision of a fair and compassionate society was to focus on what the barriers are to putting that knowledge that we do have about criminal justice reform into practice. And what we've identified, particularly over the last 3 years, has been that public attitudes are some of the biggest barriers to that change. And that's really complicated because we are, albeit a small nation, a somewhat diverse and complex one, and obviously getting enough people to change their attitudes about what works to reduce harm, how we can uplift and support each other to prevent harm in our communities, and what we do as a community when someone does breach the social contract is a really complex beast. But if we don't shift those public attitudes, then none of the people who have those levers of policy and legislative change will ever feel that they can do the things that, again, we already know are very necessary. Some of the ways that we do advocacy is, as Robin mentioned earlier, we focus on the evidence that is well understood in the sector, but also on the voices of lived experience. As Emily so rightly pointed out, any of the change that we need to make must be grounded in those experiences with the experiences of people with first-hand knowledge of that system, because without that, our change will likely take us down a path that is ultimately not rewarding and won't address the challenges that we face. So for us, I think advocacy is lifting our gaze up from the issues and the problems and focusing on what the barriers are to that change and who we can work with to overcome those barriers. So systems change is obviously a complex thing, and then you can approach it from many different ways, from inside, alongside, or from outside. And I think that advocacy and system change are completely intertwined from whatever direction you're working on that change. There's a wonderful campaigner, Dee Ray, who works on Black Lives Matter campaigning and the campaigns against police violence and for racial justice in America. And he talks about the importance of insider and outsider track advocacy, that you need people on the inside. You need to work with people who are your allies, and in some cases, not currently your allies, but you also need people building pressure from the outside. Systems are sticky and complicated and often too big to really see through one person's field of vision. So I think we really need to look at how we collaborate as advocates to see the full complexity of a system and how we can work together to change it. So I think the role of organisations like Just Speak in systems change is really crucial, because we need that space to be consistent and insistent. We need to be able to challenge people. We need to make them uncomfortable. Our ability to focus on advocacy means that we don't need to, unlike some of the other organisations, as Tim was talking about, split our time between that really important service delivery that many people do have to do because of the failure of our systems, and the important kind of calling out and calling attention to those systemic issues. And I think that is one of the great privileges that we have at Just Speak in the way that we have been funded to date, is that we can focus on where we can provide the most impact, and we see it as being primarily at that systems level change. Advocacy and system change is also crucial, as I think Emily mentioned, because it's about mobilization and building momentum, even if results aren't guaranteed. And you need to have that mobilization and that sense of where you're going and who you're going to go with to get there, so that when that opportunity does come, whatever it might be, whether it's criminal justice reform, whether it's housing, that you can leap on that opportunity. I'll just look at my time, sorry. Oh gosh, 4 minutes, great. So Just Speak has been around for about 8 years, and in that time we've built some really wonderful relationships with the people who have funded us. But we obviously have, had a range of experiences when it comes to seeking resources for the advocacy work that we do. What we found is that we've never accepted money from government in the current iteration that Just Speak is. Our sort of predecessor, Kim Workman's organisation, did work with government to some degree. Lotteries accepted, which I think is a slightly different structure. And that's really precarious, I think, for organisations whose role is primarily advocacy in a way that might be surprising to you. Obviously, there's the challenges around contracts and how the muzzling of that kind of difficult shouting about problems can result, even if there's no explicit demand, that people accepting funding won't, talk about the problems. That risk aversion that comes with understanding the consequences for your organisation if you do overstep the line, and that line perhaps sometimes being intentionally fuzzy, is a really big one. So I think that means that philanthropy really has to step into that space much more proactively. Taking money from government can also pose a challenge, I think, to advocates, because it can affect those who you're trying to influence or those who you're working alongside, their perception of who you're speaking on behalf of and who you're able to call out. So I think that's really important. Much has been said already with the summary of the research that the Centre for Social Impact did about these questions around measuring impact, but I think it's probably one of the most challenging things that we do when we're talking about why people should fund advocates and campaigners like ourselves, is that these things are complex. We're talking about some of the most entrenched, complicated problems that our society faces, so it's never going to be a question of having a theory of change, getting some money, putting it into action and seeing the results. If only it were so easy. So I think that, that can be a real complication, and I've been really glad to see some of the work that J.R. Mackenzie has done around, building a sense of trust and collaboration about how we measure our impact, and the need to work together on that front. Obviously, some of the other experiences that we've had with resources has been about that uneasiness that has been mentioned today, about concern about what that means for people's political stance, what it means for those challenges to establish power structures, and I acknowledge that can be really tricky, particularly when funders are coming from a space where they've done very different work for a very long time. And we've also sort of experienced the challenge that funding for advocacy can be very narrow in its focus. One of the things that I think we've been able to do, until last week, we were a 1.5 FTE organisation, so we've been quite small for a really long time. We're lucky enough to have a really, I think, profound impact because of all the people we work with, but the thing that has allowed us to make that impact is that our funding has not been narrow in focus, that it's given us the space and the opportunity to step into moments when they arise and to adapt and pivot, which a larger organisation would struggle to. Some practical things about what I think would help when it comes to funding systems change and advocacy. Some of it is simple things, like it's actually quite hard. J.R. Mackenzie accepting and the Todd Foundation have provided us some really generous funding in the past to get money for salaries. And I know it sounds really boring, but ultimately having someone whose primary job is to continue to push the kaupapa of what you're trying to do is crucial for that energy, that momentum, and also that knowledge transfer, which otherwise in volunteer-led organisations can very much, all those relationships that we've been talking about are so crucial to making an impact. They fall away often if you have that constant churn of people, and people need to make a living. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that. Long-term funding is obviously really crucial. Short-term projects, when it comes to systems change, I think are bound to fail. That doesn't mean that you can't fund a moment and make a real impact if the momentum is there, but I think if you're trying to work on systems like we are, which the problem is large and the battle that we're fighting is likely to be long, I think, as Robin mentioned, you need to be in it for the long haul. That's my alarm. just tautoko what was said earlier about skills, personal development and training opportunities. I think it's hard in this sector to ever find the space, time and money to upskill, but we know that what we do is really important, and we want that to be acknowledged, and one way we can do that is to invest in the people that do the work. Three really quick examples from criminal justice where I think systems and advocacy with a focus on systems change has really made an impact. We were part of a coalition working to get 17-year-olds included in New Zealand's world-leading youth justice system. And that was very much a moment where, again, the knowledge was absolutely there. The people knew what had to change. It wasn't a question of research or development. It was momentum. And it was having the convening experts, convening people with lived experience, convening people with the money to speak on the subject to kind of push for something that we knew would have incredibly positive outcomes for the young people of New Zealand, and we were really proud to be part of that. I won't go into any more of those. I'll leave those for conversations outside the breaks. I want to leave time for questions. I was talking earlier about how it's I was slightly nervous coming to speak to this forum because I have a lot of strong opinions about advocacy, systems change and philanthropy, and I'm conscious of all the other experiences that everyone in the room is bringing to this work, and that we all ultimately do share the same goal and our differences of opinion about how we might get there. But I do think that good advocacy will ultimately make many people uncomfortable, and I think we need to acknowledge that. Systems change is inherently about disrupting the status quo, and many people, including people in this room, will have benefited from the status quo. So it is inherently challenging, I think, to the reason why you're here and the privilege that you have in being here to talk about what is currently failing in our systems and who is currently most disadvantaged by that. Advocacy at its best is about speaking truth to power. Many of us in this room have power, so funding advocacy is about funding the people who might tell you things you don't want to hear, but ultimately I think that we need to hear them if we're going to change the problems that we've all acknowledged are really endemic in New Zealand, but also totally able to be changed. I'll leave it there. Thank you.